just kind of getting started. Some things you might want, you might need something to mark off your pattern with as you're working. So like a pencil or pen. And then you could also use that marking tool to mark the center of your project. So things that you would have in your kit, I'll just kind of talk about that a little bit. You've got your hoop, and that already has your fabric in it. Your fabric's probably like this one. I did get a bigger fabric, and this is called Aida Fabric. So this one has a lower number point, and the number that the point has to do with how many of the squares per inch there is. So like a 22 has 22 squares per inch, while a 16 has 16 squares per inch. Somebody was telling me they have one at home that is an 8 Aida fabric, so it has 8 squares per inch. And then you have your patterns. You've got this one that you could choose, or the other one that's Home Sweet Home, like my finished one here. You should have a needle in there. Another thing that might be useful is a threader. You could also use a wire or even a piece of paper to thread as well. And here is a threader. So if you were to use a threader, you would just put the wire in. The same idea. If you just use a little piece of wire, you could take the wire out of a twisty tie. You would just kind of do the same thing. Put your thread through that wire loop and then pull it through like so. And then your needle would be threaded. Also in your kit is your embroidery floss. And I kind of included a couple different colors, um, possibly more than what you actually need. It doesn't have to match up exactly with the colors that I've used here. Um, this is actually, the pattern was created on something called Stitch Fiddle, which is a free service online that has a grid pattern that you can just design it out and throw things together. And then as you're working, you can kind of work out the pattern you want. But you can also buy pre-made patterns as well. So this one, I don't have my fabric in yet. Your fabric is in yours, but if you were to need to tighten it or to move it around any, what you would do is just twist this up here, and then you can get your fabric and put it in here. Oh, another supply item you might need is scissors so that you can trim your threads as you go as well. And that's a little small. Okay. And then once you've got your fabric in, you might need to loosen it more to get it to stay on there. And if you like, if your fabric kind of loosens up as you're working, you can just pull on it like so around the edges, and that'll help tighten it up. And then you can tighten this back up as well. And depending on which hoop you got, some of them actually have like a Phillips head screw on it, and you can use a tool to tighten it even more. From there, you could count out your numbers and see if that's your center, but I usually just kind of go for it and work with the center that I've kind of picked. I'm pretty good at eyeballing where the center is. So I just kind of figure out where it is, and then I can stick my needle in there and move it around to kind of open up a circle. You could also take a piece of thread, just like cut off a small piece and mark it until you're ready. Like I could just mark it there, just so I know where it is when I get started. And then I'm going to look at my pattern and figure out where my middle is here as well. One thing you can do to kind of make that a little easier is you could fold your pattern, and like my pattern's a little lopsided. There's some more on empty space on each side. And I can fold it the other way. And then where they intersect, that is my center. You can mark it with a pencil or something, or you could even just like poke a hole through it with your needle. So my center is right here near the mushroom stem. And that just kind of helps me figure out where I'm going to start my project. So I'm going to pick what color I want the stem to be. And I'm going to try to pick colors that stand out on this camera because the camera kind of pushes out some of the color. And I'm going to cut a pretty good length. About the length of my arm works pretty well. You don't want it super long because then you kind of risk it getting tangled, but you also don't want it really short because you're going to be constantly putting new thread on your needle because you run out. So embroidery floss has 6 strands in it, and we usually do cross stitch with 2 strands. You could do more if you want it to have a thicker look, or you could do less for a thinner look. But I recommend pulling 1 strand at a time, as a tendency to get tangled and knot up if it is done with multiples at a time. And I might actually end up needing to pick a darker color to show up better on camera. Maybe we'll just make it silly and use the green that's right here. But I've pulled my 2 strands and then I line them back up. And then I can thread it on my needle. Yeah, and I'm gonna go with the darker color just so that it's easier for you to see. Once you've got your thread ready, we can look at our pattern and figure out where we're starting. So I'm going to start here, and each of these boxes equals 1 stitch. So I'm going to start as my first stitch, and it looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 across. So I'm going to go through that middle spot right here, and then on the back, I'm going to flip this over. And before I pull it all the way through, I'm going to hold on to this tail so that I can then stitch over it later. And there's another way we can do this too, and I'll show that for the second thread. And what we're going to do is make our first half of an X. So we've went up through this corner of the square, and there's all these little dots that make up the squares. And I'm going to go back down through. So it's made our first half of our X. And then on the back, I'm going to come back down. And because it's just like slashes that we're starting out with, it'll go right over it in a straight line. So now I'm right here. I'm going to go back down through. And I counted there were 4 of this color across. So I'm going to make 4 dashes across. So now that I have the 4, I'm going to do the second half of my X. And I'll just do that by working the back this way. And I can bring it up closer to the camera here for the second row. So I'm going to go back to my pattern. This is all pretty much a rectangle, so this is a pretty easy way to start. I did this row right here, so I could mark it off with a writing utensil. And that way I know I already did those. And then I actually want to go and do this one just so that I get it done. So the row above it, I'm just going to go to it up here, and I'm going to bring this up real close, focus it in. So I'm just going in, but it came undone. So what can happen is when your last one that you did is this stitch right here, if you go back up through it, it's just going to undo it because you're undoing the sewing. So if your next stitches are like right above it, you can just go over one like so, and then go back to doing the rest of your row. The back of your project doesn't have to be perfect. Like a lot of times people are very like picky about their backs and want to make it like all straight lines, but it really doesn't have to be perfect. It can kind of go all over the place. So like here's another project I had done, and like some of the areas, like I had some of this color here and I just went straight down here to the next space of that color. Um, though I wouldn't recommend doing like a black a long distance, like from an area that isn't going to have any stitching over it. So, like, say these flowers were a dark color, and then I had a dark color of the same color over here, I would probably tie off my threads and make it so that I don't have a string that goes across this, because like with the little holes and even lighter fabric color, it can be visible to the other side and just kind of ruin your finished piece. But the back doesn't have to look good um, otherwise, because it's the back. Nobody's going to be seeing that. A lot of times you just finish it off by gluing this down. You could also take some thread and pull it tight and it'll cinch it up back here. Or you can take it out of the hoop, keep your hoop to do another project, and put it in a frame. So going back to this, I'm just gonna continue making my slashes here. And then once I finish doing my 4, I'm gonna go back over it as an X. Now, another thing I will note is you want to make sure that you're always starting your X's the same direction. So say I'm going to do my next row and I decide to start it down here and I start going this way. I'm going the reverse of the direction I went before. And that it might not really show up completely, but sometimes it can. So you want to try to keep it going the same way. So what I would do here is take it out. So if something's not right, you can just unthread your needle and pull it out. So with this rectangle, I just keep moving forward. And this is actually a project that does take some time. Me being experienced in cross stitch, like I started cross stitching probably when I was 8. This still took me 3.5 hours. It looks simple and small, but it still took that long to do. And that's not even including the like getting started time and picking out colors and everything. I had someone the other day that did the classes in person, and she has kind of gotten into cross stitching a lot. And what she did with her patterns then was she cut them out and laminated them so that she could just do dry erase marker on them. And she could reuse them to do the same pattern multiple times. So at this point, I've also got my little tiny mushroom on my pattern over here. So I'm actually going to jump over and do those as well so that I don't have to like go back and do that area. So I'm going to count how many squares over it is. 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to 1, 2, 3 over here. So I know where I need to go. Right there. And as you're working, sometimes your thread will come undone and it just needs rethreaded. And there were 2 stitches to that little mushroom. So here you can kind of see I went a distance and it's not going to get stitched over, and you can actually kind of see that dark thread going through it. So I could have just stopped my thread and then went on. But I don't think it's that bad for this one. This is also kind of a looser woven Aida, so it does kind of show up more than others. And they make this fabric in all kinds of colors as well. Like this frog one I was working on has a blue color to it. Yeah, and if you go in the craft store, there are so many different colors of thread. So you can pretty much create any picture you want. Oh, and one fun thing is these are pretty much like pixels. So you could take any pixel art and cross stitch it as well. It works the same way. Every square would equal one stitch. So like with the mushrooms, you could do a little Mario. Or if you find a pattern that actually it's like a perler bead pattern, you could use it as a cross stitch pattern as well. As you've been stitching, you may have gotten knots. One thing you can kind of do to help with that is pick at it with the needle. I didn't get a knot yet, but like if I have one, I just kind of poke around on it and kind of pull on it with the needle. And a lot of times that can loosen it up and undo it. If you end up with one that just doesn't want to get untangled, a lot of times what I'll do is just kind of stitch over it on the back and work it into the back portion. That way it doesn't get on the front. Um, I know I have a knot somewhere in here. Yeah, I had one like over here in this green. So I just kind of worked over it to hold it in place. And it just makes a little bulky area. So here I've reached the end of this stem of the mushroom. So I can show how to finish off an end. And my needle came unthreaded again, so I'm just gonna rethread that first. There we go. So what I do to lock in my stitches after I'm finished with that color or I need to get a new thread, which always make sure you've got a little bit of thread to finish off with. Don't just keep working when it starts getting low, is just I go under the threads on the back with my needle. And cross stitch needles are rounded on the end, so it does make it a little hard to kind of like sew through things. So it might take a little bit of work to get it to go under. And then just pull it through. It's now just under those stitches and then trim it. You don't want a lot of just loose threads on the back because sometimes that'll get pulled up to the front. So then I would go to my next color. And at this point, it might be useful to start working on the mushroom, or I could even count down and go to the heart portion of it. So I'm actually going to do the mushroom. I don't know what color to really put with this green. Maybe this bright orange. So I'm going to start on the little mushroom, find my spot where I need to work, come on through, leave a bit of a tail on the back, go back to the front and do our first of a dash. I'm going to go back to the back. I'm going to go straight down over my tail to lock that down in place like that. And maybe even straighten it out a little bit so that hopefully the next couple stitches go over it. and then continue working like before. My next time I start stitching, I'll show the other way that I just recently learned how to do. And it's actually kind of helpful. So it's to create a loop in the beginning, and you can work from the front. You don't have to do the tail kind of work over thing. Though some people were finding it frustrating to do that loop thing, and they preferred doing the tail. Okay, so I have my little mushroom done. I'm going to pick up stitches on the back, pull that through, trim the tail here. So to do that loop method, you actually don't do two strands. You do a single strand, and you can do it a little bit longer, because what you do is fold it in half. Got my single strand, I'm folding it in half so that it creates a loop on the end. Thread it onto the needle where the two strands meet. And then from the front, I'm going to stitch down into the fabric. But first I'm going to figure out where I need to stitch. So I'm going to do some counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I can count over 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And there's that. That's where I'm going to stitch at. So I'm going to go down into that hole, and from the back, come out where I would normally go down for the slash across. And then I'm going to pick up that loop. So now the loop is captured, and it's there like it's going to be that dash. And I go back down through that hole that I just came up out of. So then that pulls it then to the back, and we just have our first half stitch there. And then you'll stitch along however many you need. So on the back, it ends up looking something like that instead of having a tail underneath it. So it can be a cleaner look, but also it can also be an easier way of doing it. But it just depends on how you feel about it. Some people found it harder too. Got the loop on this end. Going from the front, coming up through from the back. Make sure to go through the loop. Then go back through that same hole. But you want to make sure that you're not then going back through the loop that you went through, and make sure it's on the outside. Otherwise, it'll make it come undone. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I've got all my stitches over this way, and I'm going to go back the other direction now. So here you can see I went across 2 of the dashes. So I can undo it by going back through that hole again and then going back through the correct hole. And if you ever have stitches that don't look like they're quite matching up, you may have gone through not the whole part of the fabric. You might have like gotten slightly off to the side. Like, see how I went under where the hole is supposed to be? So if that happens, you can always go back and undo that area if you're still on that same thread, or you can kind of try to fill it in, or you can just leave it. It usually doesn't look too bad. And like mistakes do happen. It's okay. Um, Actually, this little frog, even though he's so cute, I didn't follow the pattern correctly. I forgot to color in his tummy a different color. Um, and somewhere up here, something went wrong with my count, but you can't even really tell. So a lot of times, even if you make little mistakes, nobody knows in the long run. I want to cover a last couple few things just so that you have that information when you get to it. So on your pattern, if you had one like this frog, or if you chose the Home Sweet Home one, you'll see that there's like straight lines, and that is back stitching. And what you do is you take your thread just like before and stitch. And I have a project over here that has some back stitching. So this heart is outlined with a back stitch, and I just do a stitch into each one of those areas. So I'm going to get my needle back on my thread here. So I'm just going to go down in just like we normally do, but I'm following the lines. So like on the pattern, I've got straight lines. Oh, you can't see my pattern. I'm covering it up. Just have straight lines across. So I went down in, and then I'm going to pop up on the other side of it, because if I come back up through that same hole, it'll come undone. So I'm just going to pop up just one over. And then I go back and meet this stitch right here, this hole here. And that's why it's called the back stitch. And I think I included a diagram of it as well. And Like with this one, I would just continue working all the way around the heart. And if you get to this point, because it'll probably be a while before you get to your back stitching, it's usually the last thing I do. Uh, if you have any questions, you can always contact me, and you can also stop in during any of our open make times. Or we also have a fiber arts club that meets every second Tuesday. So our next one will be October 10th. It's reversed on the screen. But it's basically any fiber craft. So you can bring your cross stitching to that. You could bring crochet, knit, or you can learn to do those things at this event. And those are 4 to 7, and it's kind of a come and go as you need kind of thing. So like if you're not able to make it exactly at 4, you can come later. Or if you need to leave because you've got something going on, you can leave before 7. You will notice that some of the back stitches on this cross over multiple squares in a way that it's not like a single square. So in those cases, you would just continue on over those multiple squares just as it's pictured. So you just go into the holes of the Aida fabric just like you do for the cross stitches. I kind of talked over what you do in the end when you're finished. You can either glue this down and then hang it up like this, or you can get a frame and put it in the frame. And you can iron it because like when you pull it out of this, it'll be a little wrinkled. And then you can also take a thread and sew around it and kind of pull it in if you want to go that route instead of hot gluing. If you left enough fabric, if I left you enough fabric, because like this one, I didn't really leave enough fabric on these edges, but I usually just tuck in and glue. And they sell a variety of different sizes of hoops as well for different projects. And if you are interested in continuing cross stitching, we do have a lot of patterns here at the library, um, including through our digital services as well. So Libby and Hoopla have some books, ebooks that have cross stitch patterns in them. And then there's also magazines through our Libby app as well. And then, of course, the physical copies here at the library. I also have a bunch of patterns that were donated a while back up here in the makerspace. So if you stop in the makerspace, if they're still here, you could pick up some of those too. I put a knot on the back so I can kind of show fixing that. So I'm gonna stick my needle in like the loop part of the knot. Bring it up close and pull on that loop. Sometimes that loosens it. So it's loosened down, and then I just pull on the thread, and that completely got it undone. So that covers everything that you need to get started. If you have any questions, you can always contact me at the information listed. As always, you can stop in to the makerspace, ask questions as well. Good luck.